A frozen mining town was burying people in secret every single night, while the church bell kept ringing for a sickness nobody had truly seen. Then a mysterious rider arrived through the winter snow with a black horse that seemed to sense death before anyone else could. The people of Black Hollow believed the mountain was cursed, but the real horror beneath the snow was fear and the lies people told to survive. One widow knew her husband had been murdered. One old priest helped bury the truth, and one young sheriff was trapped between loyalty and guilt. But the strangest part wasn't the poisoned mine or the hidden graves. It was the way the rider's horse kept staring toward the mountain like something below was still alive. Before the final bell fell silent, Black Hollow had to choose between revenge and mercy, while the mountain revealed its buried truth. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ride into tonight's story with us. The first snow of winter had fallen dirty over Black Hollow, not white, not clean, but gray with ash, from the old silver mine that sat above the town like a wound that refused to heal. The mountains surrounding the valley looked dead beneath the heavy clouds, their slopes covered in black pines and frozen stone. Wind moved through the narrow streets carrying the smell of coal smoke, wet earth, and something older beneath it all, the faint scent of graves freshly opened. Along the frozen road came a tall black horse named Ghost. The animal moved carefully across the icy ground, each breath rising into the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. Ghost was a powerful American quarter horse, large and muscular beneath the saddle, with a long, dark mane tangled by winter wind and a small white mark resting on its forehead like a faded star. Unlike most trail horses, Ghost rarely startled easily. Years beside violence and storms had made the animal calm in ways almost human. But tonight something was wrong. In the saddle rode the rider, 45 years old, tall and lean beneath a long, weathered leather coat. The rider carried the look of a man shaped by hard years and too many lonely roads. His broad shoulders slouched slightly with exhaustion rather than weakness. A dusty, dark Stetson shadowed cold, observant eyes that rarely revealed emotion. Messy, dark hair brushed against a rough, untrimmed beard, and old scars disappeared beneath cracked winter skin. Two worn Colt .45 revolvers rested low against his hips, beside an engraved silver belt buckle faded from time and sand. He did not ride like a lawman or a hero. He rode like a man who had learned long ago that surviving and living were not always the same thing. Black Hollow appeared slowly through the falling snow. The town looked buried already. Windows remained shuttered despite the hour. Few lanterns burned. No music drifted from the saloon. No children played outside. Only the church bell echoed through the valley at uneven intervals. The sound cracked and hollow like iron striking bone. Ghost suddenly stopped walking. The rider tightened the reins slightly, but the black horse refused to move. Its ears lifted sharply toward the hill, overlooking town where the cemetery sat behind a crooked iron fence. Steam burst from the animal's nostrils while its muscles locked tight beneath black skin. The rider looked toward the graves. Snow covered most of them, but several mounds near the far end still showed wet, dark earth, fresh graves. Ghost took one uncertain step backward. That bothered the rider more than the graves themselves. "Easy," he muttered quietly, but Ghost kept staring. For a long moment, neither horse nor rider moved. Wind passed through the cemetery, rattling dead branches overhead. Somewhere deeper in town, a woman coughed violently behind a closed window. Then the church bell rang again. Ghost flinched. The rider finally nudged the horse forward, though the animal continued glancing toward the graves long after they passed them. Black Hollow watched strangers the way frightened animals watched fire. Faces appeared briefly behind curtains before disappearing again. Men standing outside the general store lowered their eyes when the rider passed. Nobody greeted him. Nobody asked questions. Fear hung over the town heavier than the snow clouds above it. The inn sat near the church at the center of town. A faded wooden sign swung slowly above the porch, creaking in the cold wind. Inside, warmth existed only barely. The fireplace struggled against the winter air, and the room smelled of whiskey, wet wool, and old smoke. Behind the counter stood Clara Bennett. Clara was a woman in her late 30s with strong shoulders and tired green eyes that looked older than the rest of her face. Her chestnut brown hair had been tied loosely behind her head, though strands constantly escaped around her cheeks whenever she moved. Grief had sharpened her features rather than softened them. There was still beauty in her, but it was the kind built from endurance instead of comfort. Her husband had died the previous winter working in the mines, and since then Clara had kept the inn alive, alone. People respected her because she never complained aloud, even after hardship hollowed the warmth from her smile. Her eyes moved first to Ghost outside the window, then toward the rider's guns. "You staying the night?" she asked quietly. "Depends if the room's warmer than the road." Clara almost smiled at that. Barely. The rider placed a coin on the counter. Clara hesitated before taking it. "You should leave before dark tomorrow," she said, while sliding a room key toward him. "Folks don't trust outsiders much anymore." "Why?" The woman glanced toward the church windows. "Because people keep dying." Silence settled between them for a moment. Then the inn door opened hard behind him. Deputy Cole Mercer stepped inside, carrying snow across the floorboards. He was young, perhaps 30, but life in Black Hollow had already carved tension into his face. Cole was tall and sharp-featured, with pale blue eyes, dirty blonde hair, and a short, rough beard that never quite hid the anger sitting underneath his expression. His sheriff's coat looked too stiff, too clean compared to everyone else in town. Men like Cole often cleaned themselves carefully because control over appearance was the only control left in their lives. He noticed the rider immediately. "You armed?" Cole asked. The rider sipped the coffee Clara had poured without answering. "That usually means yes." Cole stepped closer. "We got enough trouble already. And yet here you are adding to it." Clara sighed quietly beneath her breath. Cole's jaw tightened, but exhaustion held him back from escalating further. The deputy looked toward Ghost outside the frosted window. "That horse been acting strange yet?" The rider finally looked at him directly. "What do you mean strange?" Cole hesitated too long. Then he shook his head. "Forget it." He turned and left the inn without another word. That night the wind grew worse. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the church bell rang once somewhere outside town. The rider sat alone in the small upstairs room, cleaning one revolver beneath dim lantern light. Sleep never came easily anymore. Not after the mines. Not after his brother. Few people knew the rider had once worked underground as a teenager. Fewer still knew he had watched his younger brother die beneath a collapsed tunnel during a cave-in many years ago. Since then, he hated mining towns, hated the smell of wet stone, hated the sound mountains made before they broke apart. Below the floorboards, Ghost suddenly let out a low, uneasy sound. The rider froze. Another sound followed. Not panic. Warning. He stood immediately and pulled on his coat. Outside, snow drifted heavily across the yard behind the church. Ghost stood near the stable fence with ears pinned backward and eyes fixed toward the cemetery hill. Then the horse backed away from something unseen. The rider followed the animal through the snow. Halfway up the hill, he heard it, the sound of dirt being shoveled. Someone was digging. The noise stopped abruptly before he reached the graves. When he arrived, nobody remained there. Only one grave near the fence showed disturbed snow and fresh dirt still wet beneath the frost. Ghost refused to step closer. The black horse suddenly jerked backward, breathing hard through its nostrils like it sensed danger beneath the ground itself. The rider crouched beside the grave. The wooden marker had no name yet, only a date, tonight's date. Slowly, he brushed snow away from the loose dirt near the edge. Something pale showed beneath, a boot. The rider pulled back more earth carefully until the dead man's shoe became visible beneath the shallow dirt. The leather was clean, too clean, no mud, no silver dust, no signs the man had ever worked inside a mine. And in Black Hollow, every miner carried the mountain on his boots. The rider stared silently at the grave while Ghost shifted uneasily behind him. Somewhere far below the frozen earth, deep beneath the mountain, something groaned. Morning arrived pale and bitter over Black Hollow. Snow still clung to the rooftops and cemetery fences, though dirty streaks of ash from the mine had turned much of it gray. The mountains surrounding the valley looked heavier in daylight, like enormous walls built to keep something trapped inside. Smoke drifted lazily from a handful of chimneys, but the town itself remained strangely silent. No wagons moved. No children played outside. Even the dogs stayed hidden from the streets. The rider stood beside Ghost near the church hill, staring down at the fresh grave from the night before. Snow had already begun covering the disturbed dirt again, but the image of the clean boots beneath the soil remained fixed in his mind. Miners never died clean. Not in towns like this. Ghost pawed uneasily at the frozen ground beside him. The black horse had barely rested all night. Its ears constantly twitched toward the cemetery, and every few minutes it lifted its head sharply as if listening for sounds too distant for human ears. The rider rested one gloved hand against the horse's neck and felt tension beneath the warm skin. "You hear something I don't?" he murmured quietly. Ghost only stared toward town. The church bell rang once. A woman crossing the street pulled her scarf tighter and lowered her head immediately, like the sound itself carried bad luck. Inside Clara Bennett's inn, the air smelled of burnt coffee and damp wool coats drying beside the fire. Clara stood behind the counter pouring black coffee into chipped tin cups for two exhausted miners who looked too thin for the heavy winter clothes hanging from their shoulders. One of them coughed violently into a rag before stuffing it quickly into his pocket when he noticed the rider watching. That caught his attention, not the coughing, the fear afterward. Clara noticed it too. "People here don't like others seeing weakness anymore," she said quietly after the miners left. Her tired green eyes moved towards the frosted windows, especially now. The rider sat near the stove, warming stiff hands around the coffee cup. "Tell me about the sickness." Clara hesitated. Most people in Black Hollow hesitated before speaking now, as if every sentence needed permission from fear first. "They call it the black lung fever," she finally said. "Starts with coughing, fever after that, sometimes blood." Her voice lowered further. "Then they die. How many?" 17 since autumn." The rider looked up slowly. "Too many." "And nobody leaves town?" Clara gave a tired laugh, without humor. "Snow blocks the North Pass half the winter. South trails too dangerous after dark." She wiped the counter absently. "Besides, most folks here got nowhere else to go." The rider studied her carefully. Clara Bennett carried herself like someone who had learned survival through repetition rather than strength. Her husband's death had hollowed something inside her, but it had also made her sharper, more careful. She watched people the way wounded animals watched open ground. "Your husband died from it?" Her hand stopped moving. For a second the inn became completely silent except for the crackling stove. "That's what they buried him under," she answered at last. But the way she said buried mattered more than the words themselves. Not died. Buried. Before the rider could ask more, voices rose outside. A wagon rolled slowly past the inn, carrying another coffin beneath a stained canvas sheet. Two exhausted men walked beside it, with lowered heads, while Father Elias followed behind, holding a small wooden cross against his chest. Ghost reacted instantly. The black horse jerked hard against the hitching rail, nostrils flaring violently. Its muscles tightened beneath dark skin as the wagon passed. Then Ghost backed away so suddenly the wooden rail creaked. People on the street stopped and stared nervously. One woman crossed herself. The rider stepped outside immediately, grabbing the reins before Ghost could panic further, but the horse wasn't frightened. It was warning him. Ghost kept staring at the coffin, not with fear, with distrust. And then came the moment the rider couldn't ignore anymore. Ghost lowered its head toward the wagon and suddenly bared its teeth slightly, a rare reaction for such a calm animal. The coffin rolled onward toward the cemetery. Ghost refused to stop watching it. A cold feeling settled deep inside the rider's chest. Animals knew death, but they also knew lies. That thought stayed with him the rest of the afternoon. Near dusk, snow began falling again in slow, heavy flakes. The rider walked the streets, listening carefully to conversations drifting from porches and alleyways. Nobody described seeing the sickness directly. They described rumors, stories, whispers. My cousin coughed blood. They buried him before sunrise. The fever spreads fast, but no one ever said, "I saw him die." That mattered. As darkness settled over Black Hollow, Father Elias finally approached him outside the church steps. The old priest looked exhausted beneath his heavy coat. Father Elias was tall but thin from years of hard winters and small meals. Deep wrinkles cut across his pale face, and tired gray eyes hid constant guilt beneath their softness. Once, perhaps decades ago, he had probably looked like a hopeful man. Now he looked like someone who prayed mostly out of habit. "You shouldn't ask too many questions here," the priest said gently. The rider studied him. "Because of the sickness." Father Elias glanced toward the cemetery. "Because fear makes desperate people dangerous." The rider looked toward the church windows glowing softly in the snow. "You believe it's real," the old priest answered too slowly. "That's not the same thing as truth." Then Father Elias walked away into the falling snow before more could be said. That night, Ghost woke him again, not with panic, with silence. The rider opened his eyes inside the stable loft and immediately saw the horse standing rigid below. Ghost stared toward the rear of the churchyard where an old stone building sat, partially hidden behind dead trees. The morgue. Ghost stomped once against the frozen ground, hard, then again. The rider grabbed his coat and revolver. Outside, snow muffled nearly every sound except the wind moving through the graveyard fences. Ghost refused to follow him toward the morgue. The black horse stopped 20 feet away, breathing hard and pawing at the snow, like something invisible blocked the path. That alone told him enough. The old morgue smelled of dust, wet wood, and decay. Lantern light flickered weakly across rows of shelves and crude wooden coffins stacked against the walls. Most looked recently built. Too recently. The rider moved carefully through the darkness until he reached the newest coffin near the back wall. The lid had been nailed shut in a hurry. He pried it open slowly. The smell hit first. Not sickness, metal. Inside lay a man no older than 35, with dark hair and rough miner's hands. His face looked pale beneath gray dust coating the skin. Blood had dried beneath his ribs. The rider pulled the shirt aside. Bullet wound, low and deliberate, not an accident. Then he noticed the lungs. Even beneath dim lantern light, the tissue inside the dead man's chest showed dark staining from years underground. Mining poison, not disease. No swollen glands, no signs of fever. Someone had shot this man, then buried him beneath the lie of sickness. and suddenly Ghost jerked violently outside. The rider froze. The horse snapped its head toward the morgue door, seconds before boots crunched through snow outside. Someone was there. A shadow crossed the frosted window. Then running footsteps disappeared into the darkness. The rider rushed outside with revolver drawn, but the figure vanished beyond the cemetery hill. Only Ghost remained there, staring toward the empty road with ears pinned back and breath rising heavily into the cold air. The rider lowered the gun slowly. Whoever it was had been watching him all night. Snow melted slowly across Black Hollow the next morning, turning the streets into gray slush mixed with ash from the mountains above. The church bell had not rung since midnight, yet the silence felt worse somehow, as if the town itself were listening for something beneath the ground. Smoke drifted low between the buildings, trapped beneath heavy clouds pressing against the valley. People moved quickly now, avoiding eye contact even more than before. Word had spread that the rider had been seen near the morgue. And in towns ruled by fear, questions became dangerous faster than guns. Ghost sensed it too. The black horse stood outside Clara Bennett's inn, with restless tension running through its body. Every few minutes, Ghost lifted its head toward the northern mountains, where the old silver mine sat hidden among cliffs and dead pine forests. The rider had learned long ago to trust that behavior. Animals survived because they listened to instincts people ignored. Inside the inn, Clara quietly placed a plate of eggs and stale bread across from him. Her green eyes looked more tired than yesterday. She had barely slept. "You should stop asking about the dead," she muttered softly while wiping her hands against her apron. The rider looked up from the coffee cup. "You want me to?" Clara hesitated. "No," she admitted. "I just know what happens to people who do." Wind rattled the windows beside them. The rider studied her carefully. Clara Bennett was the kind of woman who had spent too long carrying grief without allowing herself to collapse beneath it. The lines near her mouth had deepened over the years from swallowing anger instead of speaking it. Since her husband's death, she trusted almost nobody, but beneath that caution still lived something dangerous in places like Black Hollow. Decency. "Your husband worked the mine?" he asked. Clara nodded slowly. "Since he was 16. "What was his name?" "Daniel Bennett." The way she said the name changed the room slightly, not softer, more painful. "He died 6 months ago," she continued quietly. "They told me he coughed blood and collapsed underground." Her fingers tightened around the towel in her hands. "But Daniel came home the night before, scared out of his mind." She lowered her voice further, said the mountain was poisoning men. The rider remained silent. "Next morning," Clara whispered, "they buried him before sunset." Outside, Ghost suddenly jerked its head sharply towards the north road. The rider noticed immediately. Someone was approaching town. A wagon rolled through the snow an hour later, carrying crates stamped with the faded silver crest of the Vale Mining Company. Behind it rode 3 armed men wearing heavy coats, darkened by mine dust. At the center rode Gideon Vale. Even old age could not fully soften the force inside the man. Gideon Vale sat tall in the saddle despite being near 60, his broad frame wrapped in an expensive black wool coat lined with fur. Silver hair rested neatly beneath a dark hat, and a trimmed gray beard sharpened the severe angles of his face. Deep scars marked one side of his jaw from a cave-in decades earlier. People stepped aside when he passed, not from love, but from the complicated respect born when survival depends on one man for too long. Years ago, Gideon Vale had saved Black Hollow from starvation after a brutal winter destroyed nearby cattle towns. He reopened the silver mine when nobody else would risk it. Families survived because of him. And now, the entire town belonged to the mountain. Gideon stopped outside the inn and looked directly at the rider through the frosted windows before dismounting. The room grew quiet when he entered. "Stranger," Gideon said calmly, removing leather gloves one finger at a time. His voice carried confidence without needing volume. "Folks tell me you've taken interest in my town." The rider leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your town?" Gideon almost smiled. "Everything here exists because of that mine." The rider noticed something then, not arrogance, exhaustion, the kind worn by men forced to make ugly choices, long enough they no longer remembered where morality ended. "You ever work underground?" Gideon asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "A long time ago." "Then you understand." Gideon glanced toward the mountains beyond the windows. "Men die in mines. That's the price buried beneath every silver coin." Before the rider could answer, another man entered behind Gideon, Marcus Flint. Where Gideon Vale carried controlled authority, Marcus Flint carried violence barely restrained. Flint was a thick-shouldered man in his 40s with shaved dark hair, a broken nose twisted sideways from old fights, and deep scars crossing both hands. Coal-black stubble shadowed his jaw permanently. His eyes held the dead calm of someone who had hurt people. Often enough, it no longer disturbed him. Years as mine foreman had turned him into the mountain's enforcer. Marcus watched the rider like a wolf, deciding whether something belonged in its territory. "Sheriff says this drifter's been snooping around graves," Flint muttered. Deputy Cole Mercer appeared near the doorway almost immediately after, clearly uncomfortable. His pale eyes moved nervously between Gideon and the rider. "Told you already," Cole said carefully. "Town's tense enough." Gideon raised one hand gently. "That's enough." The room fell silent again. Then Ghost suddenly screamed outside, not a normal horse cry. Panic. The rider moved first. By the time he reached the street, Ghost had backed nearly into the hitching rail, eyes fixed toward the northern mountain trail. Snow blew violently across the road, while the black horse stomped hard against the frozen ground. Again. The rider followed Ghost's gaze. A deep rumble echoed faintly from somewhere beneath the mountains. Marcus Flint's face changed instantly. "Everybody move," he barked. Seconds later, the distant sound of collapsing rock thundered through the valley. A mine tunnel had partially caved in. People rushed into the streets in fear. Miners exchanged terrified looks. Gideon Vale closed his eyes briefly, like a man hearing an old nightmare return. But Ghost kept staring toward the mountains long after the sound faded. The horse had sensed it before anyone else, and that frightened the rider more than the collapse itself. By evening, snow had turned into freezing rain. The rider followed the northern trail alone, while Ghost walked uneasily beside him. The path toward the mine twisted through dead pine forests and cliffs, stained black from decades of smoke and blasting powder. The mine entrance appeared near sunset, or rather, entrances, plural. That was the first lie exposed. Several hidden tunnel openings remained active behind wooden barricades, and smoke rose from ventilation shafts despite claims the mine had mostly closed for winter. Thin, exhausted workers moved between buildings carrying crates beneath armed guards. The mine was still running. Secretly, Ghost refused to approach the largest tunnel. The black horse planted its hooves hard against the mud, ears pinned backward. Its nostrils widened as it sniffed the air. Then it backed away. The rider smelled it moments later. Metal, sulfur, rotting earth, poison. Near the lower supply shed, a miner sat coughing violently beside stacked barrels. He looked barely alive. Thin shoulders trembled beneath a torn coat, and dark blood stained the cloth pressed against his mouth. His skin carried a pale gray tint beneath the dirt. The man noticed the rider watching. Fear entered his eyes immediately. Not fear of dying, fear of speaking. The rider crouched beside him quietly. "How long?" The miner swallowed painfully before answering. "Months. Why stay? The man laughed weakly through blood. Because starving's slower. Another coughing fit bent him forward. Then the miner grabbed the rider's sleeve suddenly with trembling fingers. It ain't sickness, he whispered hoarsely. It's the mountain. Footsteps approached nearby. The miner released him instantly in terror. Marcus Flint appeared from the shadows holding a lantern. For several long seconds neither man spoke. Rain hissed softly against the rocks around them. Then Marcus glanced toward the dying miner with complete indifference. Careful who you listen to, he said coldly. Folks around here get confused before they die. The rider looked toward the mountain tunnels behind him. No, they weren't confused. They were trapped. As darkness swallowed the valley, Ghost suddenly turned its head toward an old wooden office near the mine entrance. A ledger sat visible through the rain-covered window. The rider stepped inside after Flint disappeared. Most pages listed supply shipments and worker names. Until one section near the back. Accident reports. Dozens of names, covered up, hidden, and halfway down the page, he found it. Thomas Bennett, Clara's father, marked dead 20 years earlier. Mine collapse. No body recovered. The rider stared at the page silently while rain hammered against the roof above him. Black Hollow had been burying the truth far longer than anyone realized. Black Hollow changed after the mine collapse. Not all at once. Not loudly. Fear rarely arrived like gunfire. It spread quietly like poison through water. By the third morning after the rider discovered the hidden accident records, nearly every window in town stayed covered after sunset. Lanterns burned lower. Conversations stopped when strangers approached. Men carried rifles even to fetch coal or water. Snow continued melting beneath cold gray rain, turning the streets into black mud that smelled faintly of sulfur drifting down from the mountain. Ghost hated the town now. The black horse barely rested anymore. Every night Ghost stood facing north toward the mine instead of sleeping. Sometimes the animal would suddenly lift its head from silence and stare into the darkness as though listening to distant sounds beneath the earth itself. The rider had seen frightened horses before. This was different. Ghost looked warningly calm. That unsettled him more. Inside Clara Bennett's inn, tension lived in every room. Travelers had stopped coming weeks ago, leaving Clara with barely enough money to keep the fireplace burning. The inn smelled of damp wood, boiled potatoes, and exhaustion. Clara herself looked thinner each day. Shadows had settled beneath her tired green eyes, and loose strands of chestnut hair framed a face worn sharp by too many sleepless nights. The rider found her boarding up part of the kitchen window near dusk. "You expecting trouble?" he asked. Clara gave a humorless smile. "In Black Hollow," she hammered another nail into the wood. "Always." Outside, two men argued violently near the butcher shop over a sack of flour. Across the street, a woman hurried her children indoors after spotting one of the coughing miners walking past. Nobody trusted sickness anymore. Worse than that, nobody trusted each other. Fear had become the town's new law. Deputy Cole Mercer arrived shortly after dark, carrying a bottle of whiskey beneath his coat. Snowmelt dripped from the brim of his hat, while frustration hardened every movement. He looked exhausted in ways youth could no longer hide. His pale blue eyes carried permanent tension now, and the rough blonde beard along his jaw had grown uneven from sleepless nights. "I ain't here to arrest anybody," he muttered before Clara could speak. She poured him coffee anyway. Cole sat heavily across from the rider near the fire. For a long while, nobody spoke. Only the wind rattled against the boarded windows. Finally, Cole rubbed both hands over his face. "You think you figured this town out?" he asked quietly. The rider leaned back slightly. "Think nobody here's telling the whole truth." Cole laughed bitterly at that. "My father died in that mine when I was 11. His voice lowered. Rock collapse took half the tunnel with him. He stared into the fire instead of at either of them. Gideon Vale paid for every funeral himself, fed families through winter, kept the town alive. Clara remained silent. Cole continued after a moment. People outside Black Hollow think survival's simple. They got no idea what winter up here does to folks. His jaw tightened. If the mine closes completely, this town dies before spring. The rider studied him carefully. Deputy Cole Mercer wasn't cruel. He was trapped. There was a difference. "And what happens if the mine stays open?" the rider asked quietly. Cole's eyes drifted toward the church windows across the street. Nobody answered. Later that night, Father Elias asked the rider to walk with him. Snow fell lightly again while the old priest led him through the cemetery path behind the church. Father Elias moved slower than before, his long black coat swaying weakly in the freezing wind. Deep wrinkles lined his pale face, and exhaustion weighed so heavily beneath his gray eyes that he no longer looked fully present in the world around him. The cemetery lantern flickered beside them. "I used to believe truth solved things," the priest said softly, "when I was younger." The rider listened without speaking. Father Elias stopped beside one of the older graves near the hill. "My son is buried there." The rider looked toward the weathered cross. The old priest's voice nearly broke. "Winter famine took him 30 years ago." His gloved hands trembled slightly. "No food, no medicine. We buried children every week." He swallowed hard. "When Gideon reopened the mine, people survived." Wind passed through the graveyard. Father Elias lowered his head. "So when men started dying again," his voice weakened further, "I told myself silence was mercy." The rider looked at the old priest for a long moment. "You helped bury them." Father Elias closed his eyes. "Yes." Not defensively, not proudly, like confession from a man already punishing himself. "I kept telling myself it prevented panic," the priest whispered. "That if people feared sickness more than starvation, they would stay calm." His breathing shook unevenly in the cold. But fear never stays calm. Somewhere behind the church, Ghost suddenly let out a sharp warning sound. The rider turned instantly. The black horse stood near the water well at the center of town, its ears pinned backward violently while it stomped hard against the mud. Then Ghost jerked backward so suddenly the rope snapped loose from the hitching rail. The rider moved fast. Ghost rushed toward him and shoved hard against his shoulder, with enough force to nearly knock him sideways away from the well. "What the hell?" Then the smell hit them. Metal. Rot. A woman nearby screamed. Dark liquid suddenly bubbled upward from the well bucket before spilling over the sides. The water had turned black. People stumbled backward in horror. One man crossed himself immediately. Another shouted that the sickness had poisoned the water now. Panic spread through the square within seconds. But the rider wasn't looking at the well. He was looking at Ghost. The horse had known before anyone else. Ghost stood rigid beside him, nostrils wide, staring north toward the mountain with cold certainty in its eyes. And for the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, the rider felt something unfamiliar crawl beneath his ribs. Not fear, faith, not in God, in the animal beside him. The town nearly erupted after that. Families locked themselves indoors before full dark. Some miners threatened to leave entirely despite the snow-covered passes. Others accused neighbors of poisoning the well deliberately. Deputy Cole spent most of the evening stopping fights before they turned deadly. Marcus Flint and several armed mine guards arrived near midnight to calm the panic, though their presence only worsened things. Flint looked more dangerous than ever beneath the lantern light. Broad shoulders wrapped in a black oilskin coat, while rainwater dripped from his scarred hands. He carried authority like a weapon. Nobody drinks from the south well until morning, he barked at the crowd. Mine runoff probably leaked into the water line. Probably, that word stayed with the rider, because Flint didn't sound surprised. Near dawn, Clara finally found him outside, the stable brushing snow from Ghost's coat. Her face looked pale beneath the cold morning light. For several seconds she simply stood there watching the horse, quietly. "Daniel tried to tell people," she said softly. The rider stopped brushing. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around herself. 3 weeks before he died, Daniel came home covered in mud and shaking. Tears threatened her voice now, though she fought them hard. Said the mine tunnels were poisoning the water underground. Said men were disappearing after trying to quit. Ghost turned its head slowly toward her. The black horse watched Clara with the same stillness it watched graves. "He wanted to leave town," she whispered. "Wanted to bring me south before winter." Her breathing trembled unevenly. Then he told Gideon Vale he was going public. The rider already knew the answer before she spoke again. Clara's eyes filled with tears she had held back for months. "The next day," she whispered, "they said he died from the sickness." Silence settled heavily between them. Snow drifted softly across the empty street, while Ghost stared north toward the mountain once more. Watching. Waiting. Like the horse already knew the dead were not finished speaking yet. The explosion came just before midnight. Not loud at first. The mountain groaned. That was the sound that woke Black Hollow from uneasy sleep. A deep, unnatural vibration rolling beneath the valley like something enormous shifting underground. Windows rattled, snow slid from rooftops. Dogs hidden beneath porches began barking wildly, and Ghost screamed. The black horse jerked upright beside the stable before the first blast ever reached town. Its eyes widened white in the darkness while its powerful body trembled with violent instinct. The rider woke instantly at the sound. He had heard horses panic before storms, before fires, before gunfights. This was different. Ghost wasn't afraid. Ghost knew. A second later, the explosion hit. The northern mountain erupted with a thunderous roar that shook the entire valley. Orange fire burst briefly from one of the upper mine shafts before darkness swallowed it again. Then came the sound afterward. The sound the rider hated most in the world. Collapsing tunnels. The same sound that had buried his younger brother years ago beneath a mountain in Colorado. For one terrible moment he stood frozen inside the stable while memory clawed up from somewhere deep and poisoned inside him. Dust, darkness, screaming miners trapped underground, the smell of broken earth. Then another explosion echoed through Black Hollow. People flooded into the streets half-dressed and terrified. Snow mixed with ash drifting down from the mountain while panicked voices rose across town. "The mine blew! Gas leak! God help us!" And then the smell arrived. Sulfur, metal, poison. A dark cloud rolled slowly down from the northern slopes toward Black Hollow like black fog swallowing the valley. Ghost backed violently against the stable doors, nostrils flaring wide. The rider grabbed the reins immediately. Easy. But Ghost refused to calm down. The black horse kept staring toward the mountain with terrifying focus. Then Ghost suddenly jerked hard against the reins and began pulling north, not away from danger, toward it. That alone made the rider move. The streets collapsed into chaos within minutes. Families rushed through snow carrying blankets, lanterns, crying children. Deputy Cole Mercer shouted himself hoarse, trying to organize people away from the northern road, while Father Elias rang the church bell over and over again through the smoke-filled air. But something was wrong. The bell sounded weaker tonight, like fear itself had exhausted the old priest. The rider found Clara Bennett near the inn, helping an elderly couple into a wagon. Her chestnut hair had come loose completely now, blowing wildly through ash-filled wind while panic sharpened her exhausted face. "The gas is moving downhill," she shouted. "People can't breathe near the north quarter." The rider looked toward the mountain. The black cloud thickened between the trees. Ghost suddenly yanked hard against him again. The horse wanted the mine. The rider trusted that instinct more than the town's panic. "Get everyone south of the church," he told Clara. "No fires, no lanterns near the gas." Clara stared at him for half a second before nodding immediately. That was when Marcus Flint appeared through the smoke. The foreman looked like the mountain itself had tried killing him already. Blood ran down one side of his forehead, mixing with black mine dust across his scarred face. His heavy coat hung torn near the shoulder and one arm barely moved correctly. "The lower tunnels collapsed," Marcus rasped through coughing. "Workers still trapped inside." Deputy Cole grabbed him furiously. "How many?" Marcus didn't answer fast enough. Cole understood immediately. There were more workers underground than anyone in town had been told. The secret mine had never stopped running. And now the mountain had finally answered. Ghost stomped violently against the frozen ground, once, twice, then suddenly froze. The horse lifted its head sharply toward the northern ridge, ears pinned backward with terrifying stillness. The rider knew that look now. "Move," he shouted. A heartbeat later, the upper cliff above the mine entrance collapsed entirely. Rock and snow exploded downward with a sound like the world splitting open. The main tunnel entrance vanished beneath tons of stone, while workers and guards barely escaped the avalanche. Ghost had sensed the collapse seconds before it happened. Even Marcus Flint looked shaken now. The rider turned toward the sealed emergency tunnels farther down the ridge. "Those lower shafts still connect to the ventilation routes." Marcus hesitated. That hesitation confirmed everything. The rider grabbed him by the coat. "Answer me." "Yeah." "Then people are still alive down there." Without another word, the rider mounted Ghost and rode directly toward the lower tunnels, while chaos swallowed Black Hollow behind him. The mountain looked alive tonight. Smoke poured from broken shafts while tremors rolled beneath the frozen earth every few minutes. Workers stumbled through snow, coughing blood into their sleeves. Some cried openly, others simply stared blankly like men already halfway buried. Near the lower ridge, heavy chains sealed several hidden entrances behind wooden barricades. The rider dismounted immediately. These tunnels weren't closed, Deputy Cole realized beside him. Marcus Flint looked away. The rider smashed the first lock open with a mining hammer lying nearby. Cold, poisoned air rushed from the darkness inside. Ghost refused to enter the tunnel. Instead, the black horse circled restlessly near the entrance, ears twitching constantly beneath drifting ash. Then Ghost suddenly turned sharply toward the eastern ridge and pulled violently against the reins. The rider followed. Behind a collapsed supply shed lay another hidden ventilation shaft, half buried in snow, and beneath it, voices, weak, trapped miners. The rider dropped into the shaft without hesitation while Ghost remained above, pacing violently along the snow-covered rocks. Inside, darkness swallowed nearly everything, except weak lantern light from buried workers deeper below. Poison gas burned the lungs with every breath. The trapped miners looked half dead already. One of them was barely older than 18, a thin boy named Eli Turner with trembling hands and soot-blackened blonde hair plastered across his pale face. Terror had hollowed him completely. Another older worker lay crushed beneath timber supports, coughing blood onto frozen stone. "Please," Eli whispered hoarsely, "don't leave us." The rider helped drag them upward one by one while the mountain groaned overhead. Then Ghost screamed again from outside. The rider froze instantly, not panic, warning. He shoved the last miner upward just as the shaft ceiling cracked violently above him. The tunnel collapsed seconds later. Outside, Ghost stood rearing against the snowstorm, eyes wild with urgency. The black horse had saved him again. By dawn, Black Hollow finally saw the truth. The collapsed tunnels exposed hidden mine chambers beneath the ridge. Bodies of workers long listed as buried from sickness remained trapped below the mountain. Secret ledgers surfaced. Illegal tunnels. Poison runoff channels flowing directly beneath town. The lie could no longer survive daylight. Neither could Gideon Vale. The townspeople dragged him into the street near the church, while snow and ash drifted together through pale morning light. Rage consumed Black Hollow now. Men carried ropes. Women screamed accusations through tears. Deputy Cole barely held the crowd back. Gideon stood silently in the center of it all. For the first time, he looked old, not powerful, not feared, just tired. "I kept this town alive," Gideon said weakly while the mob closed around him. "Without the mine, you all would have starved years ago." "By poisoning us?" someone screamed. Fear twisted the crowd into something ugly. The rider stepped between them before the first rope tightened. "Stop." Nobody listened. Then Ghost moved forward beside him. The black horse planted itself directly between Gideon and the mob, ears pinned back while snow blew through its dark mane. And somehow, people stopped. The rider looked at the crowd. "Fear buried the truth," he said quietly. "Don't bury yourselves with it." Silence spread slowly across the street, not forgiveness, but exhaustion. Then came the sound, a child screaming from somewhere near the mine. Everyone turned. One of the lower shafts had reopened during the collapse. Workers were still trapped. Gideon Vale stared toward the mountain for a long moment while snow fell softly around him. Then he stepped away from the crowd. Nobody stopped him. Marcus Flint shouted after him once, but Gideon never looked back. The old mine owner disappeared alone into the poisoned tunnel, carrying only a lantern. He never came out again. By nightfall, the church bell finally stopped ringing. For the first time in months, Black Hollow sat completely silent. Morning came quietly to Black Hollow for the first time in months. No church bell rang through the valley. No wagon carried another coffin uphill through the snow. No smoke drifted from the cemetery hill, where fresh graves had appeared nearly every week since autumn. Instead, pale sunlight broke slowly through thinning clouds above the mountains, touching the rooftops with soft silver light while melting snow dripped steadily from the eaves of buildings that had seemed dead only days earlier. The silence felt unfamiliar, not empty, peaceful. The rider stood beside Ghost near the churchyard while townspeople gathered below the hill, carrying shovels, lanterns, and wooden crosses. Men who had once hidden behind fear now worked side by side without speaking much. Women brought blankets and hot stew to exhausted miners rescued from the tunnels. Children cautiously stepped back onto the muddy streets, as though unsure whether the nightmare had truly ended. Black Hollow looked wounded, but alive. Ghost watched everything quietly. The black horse no longer seemed restless beneath the winter air. Its breathing had slowed. The tension inside its body had eased for the first time since arriving in town. Occasionally, the horse still glanced toward the northern mountains, but without fear now. More like memory. Below the cemetery hill, Father Elias led the final burial service. The old priest looked thinner than ever, yet something inside him had changed. His shoulders no longer carried the same crushing weight. His tired, gray eyes still held sorrow, but not hopelessness. Weeks earlier, Father Elias had spoken like a man apologizing to God for remaining alive. Today, he sounded like someone learning how to speak honestly again. Snow melted softly around the graves while he read names aloud, real names, not lies buried beneath sickness reports or hidden ledgers. Families cried openly now, Not the fearful silence Black Hollow had grown used to, but grief finally allowed into daylight. Clara Bennett stood among them wearing a dark wool coat, her chestnut hair tied loosely behind her neck, while cold wind moved through loose strands around her face. Tears filled her tired green eyes when Father Elias spoke Daniel Bennett's name. Yet she did not look away from the grave this time. The rider watched quietly from a distance. He understood something now. Truth did not heal people immediately. It simply allowed healing to begin. Deputy Cole Mercer approached him near the church fence after the service ended. The younger man looked older than when they first met, though not weaker. The permanent tension around his pale blue eyes had softened slightly. His sheriff's coat now carried a newly pinned silver badge where the deputy star once sat crooked. Sheriff Mercer. The title still looked strange on him. "You leaving soon?" Cole asked quietly. "That's usually how roads work." Cole almost smiled at hearing the old answer again. For a moment, both men watched townspeople repairing broken wagons below the hill. "I spent years thinking fear kept order," Cole admitted after a while. "Guess all it really does is keep people quiet." The rider looked toward the mountain. "Quiet enough for bad men to sound reasonable." Cole nodded slowly, then his eyes drifted toward the cemetery. "You think Gideon meant any of it? Going back into the mine?" The rider took longer answering that question than expected. "I think people get lost slowly," he finally said. "Same way they find their way back." Cole stared silently toward the north ridge, where smoke no longer rose from the mine. Nobody spoke Gideon Vale's name much anymore, not because they forgave him, because they understood him too well. By afternoon, Black Hollow began breathing again. Windows opened for the first time in weeks. Laundry lines appeared behind homes. The butcher reopened his shop, while children chased one another through muddy streets, still streaked with melting snow. Somewhere near the saloon, somebody played a harmonica badly enough to make people laugh for the first time in months. That sound affected the rider more than he expected. Laughter always sounded strange in towns that had forgotten it. Clara reopened the inn fully before sunset. Fresh stew simmered over the fire while travelers from nearby logging camps slowly returned now that rumors of plague had faded. The inn felt warmer tonight, not because of the fire, but because people finally spoke above whispers again. Clara found the rider brushing Ghost near the stable behind the inn. "You know," she said softly, "most folks around here expected you to disappear after the mine collapsed." The rider ran the brush slowly along Ghost's dark neck. "Would have been simpler. But you stayed." He looked toward the mountains without answering. Clara studied him quietly. Her grief still existed. It probably always would, but now it sat beside something else stronger than sorrow. Relief. "You gave this town back its truth," she whispered. The rider shook his head slightly. Town already had the truth. His hand rested briefly against Ghost's mane. Just needed somebody stubborn enough to stop looking away. Ghost nudged his shoulder gently. Clara smiled at that. Then came the moment the rider would remember long after Black Hollow disappeared behind him. A little girl approached the stable carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth. The child looked no older than 9, small beneath an oversized winter coat patched at both elbows. Thick, dark curls framed her round face, beneath a wool cap nearly sliding over curious brown eyes. Her name was Lucy Hale, daughter of one of the rescued miners from the lower tunnels. Weeks earlier, she had barely spoken after believing her father dead. Now, nervous energy followed every movement she made. She stopped a few feet away from Ghost. Most children feared the large black horse at first. Lucy didn't. Ghost lowered its head slowly toward her instead. The little girl unwrapped the cloth carefully and revealed a small, polished piece of silver ore. hanging from a leather string. "My daddy said this came from the first tunnel ever dug here," Lucy said shyly, "before everything got bad." The rider crouched slightly to her level. Lucy held the silver out toward him. "So you remember us?" Something tightened painfully inside his chest, not because of the silver, because children still believed remembering mattered. The rider accepted the gift carefully. For several seconds he simply held it in silence while snowflakes drifted softly through fading evening light around them. Then he tied the silver charm beside the small pouch of wildflower seeds already hanging from Ghost's saddle, the same seeds Ellie from Dry Creek had once given him far south of these mountains. Ghost turned its head slightly, watching. The black horse looked calm, almost proud. That night the church bell remained silent. No death announcements, no warning, only wind moving softly through the valley. Long after midnight, the rider stood alone beside Ghost outside the stable, while Black Hollow slept peacefully for the first time in nearly a year. Lantern light glowed warmly behind reopened windows across town. Somewhere in the distance, somebody laughed quietly inside a saloon. The rider thought about leaving earlier than dawn. He always did. A man without a home survived by never mistaking gratitude for belonging. But something kept him standing there longer than necessary. Maybe the silence, maybe the relief, or maybe the strange way Ghost no longer watched the cemetery. Before sunrise, snow began falling lightly again. The rider saddled Ghost quietly while the town still slept beneath pale blue dawn. The black horse stood patient and still beneath the cold air, dark mane shifting softly in the wind. As they rode past the cemetery hill one final time, the rider noticed something immediately. Ghost never looked toward the graves, not once. Since arriving in Black Hollow, the horse had watched the dead constantly, ears twitching toward buried lies beneath frozen ground. Now Ghost only looked ahead, toward the road, toward the mountains beyond morning light. The rider glanced back once at Black Hollow. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys now. No church bell rang, no fresh grave waited beneath the snow. Then horse and rider disappeared slowly into the white horizon together, carrying with them another memory of broken people who had finally found the courage to face the truth buried beneath their fear. And behind them, for the first time in many months, Black Hollow remained quiet. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way people expect. Sometimes he sends a stranger on a lonely road. Sometimes he sends a warning through the silence. And sometimes he speaks through the quiet loyalty of an animal that senses danger before human hearts are willing to face the truth. Black Hollow survived the winter not because its people were perfect, but because they finally stopped hiding from what fear had turned them into. And maybe that is how grace works in real life too. Not by erasing pain overnight, but by giving people one more chance to choose compassion over fear, truth over comfort, and mercy over revenge. Every town has its own hidden wounds. Every family carries struggles nobody else fully sees. Maybe you are fighting your own winter right now. Maybe someone watching this story feels tired, lost, afraid, or forgotten. But as long as there is still kindness left in this world, hope is never fully buried. If this story meant something to you, share where you are watching from in the comments. Tell us what moment touched your heart the most. And if you believe stories about faith, redemption, and humanity still matter, don't forget to subscribe and ride with us into the next journey. May God watch over you and your family tonight. May he guide you through every dark road ahead, and may you never lose the courage to keep moving forward even in the coldest winters of life.